Mercedes-Benz is one of the oldest and most luxurious car companies in the world, worth around $80 billion, but being among the most desired and expensive cars today. It's easy to forget its early humble beginnings. It all started with a poor engineer who faced many doubts and failures in his pursuit of building the first horseless carriage. In spite of his challenges, he proved everyone wrong and turned his small venture into the world's first and biggest production car company during the late 19th century. But what started as an inspiring success story took a surprisingly dark turn when the company profited from supplying military vehicles to the Nazis under the work of forced laborers. So sit back and relax, because today we'll be covering the insane story of Mercedes-Benz and the man who brought automobiles to life. Karl Benz Foreign was born in November 1844 in the German town of Mollberg. Born into a low-class household, his father was a locomotive driver who barely managed to sustain his family enough to get by. However, when Karl turned 2 years old, his father passed away, leaving him and his mother in dire financial straits. Needless to say, Ben's childhood wasn't easy, but despite living in poverty and going to bed with an empty stomach, his mother did everything she could to make sure her son had a good education. Thanks to her, Karl was able to attend school and showed signs of brilliance at a very young age, most notably in chemistry and mechanics. By the time he was 15, Karl decided to follow in his father's footsteps and passed the entrance exam for mechanical engineering at the University of Karlsruhe, where he met a teacher that would eventually play a big role in his life. Ferdinand Rettenberger is regarded as the main figure who transformed mechanical engineering from a workshop-based profession into a technical science in Germany, and was a huge believer that steam engines, which were mostly used for railways and boats at the time, were quickly becoming the thing of the past. Under his teaching, Benz's interest in horseless carriages really started to take off, and being a regular bicycle rider himself, he began tinkering around with his bike, experimenting with possible ways he could create a motorized vehicle. By then, many engineers and inventors had already attempted to create the first automobile, and while a few of them did manage to build self-propelled vehicles, these early inventions weren't fully practical yet. Karl noticed that most of these early vehicles were based on steam engine technology, and under the guidance of Professor Rettenbach, he soon realized the need for a totally different concept. While many people initially laughed at his vision, he always believed it was he just needed more time to prove it. After graduating from Karlsruhe at the age of 19, Ben spent the next 7 years working several engineering and construction jobs, and while he struggled to fit in with any of them, he used everything he learned to kickstart his own venture. In 1871, at age 27, Karl partnered with a mechanic named August Ritter, and together they began operating in an iron foundry and mechanical workshop in Mannheim. At that same time, Benz kept working on his side project, trying to develop a motorized carriage, so having a partner to help him run the business seemed essential. But unfortunately for Karl, his business partner turned out to be unreliable, and after their tools were impounded by local authorities, their company struggled immensely during its first year. Luckily, Karl had also met a woman around that time, Bertha, who would go on to become his wife a few years later. Born into a wealthy family, Bertha was a woman of strong values and couldn't stand to see her fiancé's efforts being wasted by his business partner, so she decided to use her own dowry to buy out Ritter's entire share of the company, placing her and Karl in full control of the business. Together, they were able to turn the situation around and keep the business afloat during the next 10 years. Despite all the struggles, it was during this period when Karl was able to show his true genius, making major developments and breakthroughs in his side experiments, most notably developing a gasoline two-stroke engine in 1879. To earn more revenue, he also began to patent his inventions, such as his engine speed regulation system, ignition via a battery system, spark plug, carburetor, clutch, gear shift, and a water radiator. With these designs, Karl was not only getting closer to achieving his dream of a horseless carriage, but they also allowed him to add more products that he could sell from his business. However, the business wasn't going as well as he had hoped. You see, the production costs from Karl's venture had risen so much the banks demanded that it be incorporated. This forced him to associate with other investors and eventually turn his business into a joint stock company. In 1882, at the end, Karl was left with only 5% of his company's shares and thus was downgraded from his position. To make matters worse, his ideas were no longer taken into account when the company designed new products. In fact, he had no say whatsoever in the company anymore. Frustrated and hurt with this arrangement, Karl packed up his things and left the corporation the following year. Leaving his company came as a hard blow for Karl, but the disappointment made him even more determined to be successful. His longtime passion for bicycles would bring him to Max Rose and Friedrich Wilhelm, two men who owned a bicycle repair shop in Mannheim. Together they established Benson C and focused on manufacturing industrial machines and stationary gas engines. Unlike Karl's previous venture, this one started pretty well and became quite profitable within a short period of time. With steady income pouring in and a staff of 25 people, Benz finally directed his main focus toward his lifelong dream, building an automobile using his gas engine instead of simply adding a motor to a carriage. Karl built the carriage around the motor, and using similar technology to that of a bicycle, he constructed what many considered to be the first true automobile in 1885, the Benz patent motor wagon. This two-seater vehicle ran on 3 wire wheels forming a tricycle and was powered by a gasoline 4-stroke motor. Its one-cylinder engine produced 2/3 of a horsepower and could go around 7 miles per hour. Benz knew this was revolutionary, and after testing and refining his vehicle, he drove his wonder car out to the public in the summer of 1886. However, he received mixed reviews from critics. While some admired his creation, most people were skeptical about the machine, and many didn't want him to drive around on the main streets for fear that the vehicle might explode. Others were even convinced that Benz was the devil driving an infernal carriage. Karl's business partners weren't too happy about it either. His obsession with the automobile kept him away from his work, and they couldn't see how his invention could be of use. Why would anyone buy such a machine, they argued. It's no quicker than a horse, it can break down easily, and it can run out of fuel. Nevertheless, Karl Benz was convinced that his horseless carriage was the future and began manufacturing cars for sale in 1888, the first person in the world to do so. His biggest supporter was his wife, who would often stay with her husband in the workshop offering him new suggestions. But even after adding improvements, people still couldn't see Karl's vision. On the other hand, the few people who bought the cars could only use them to cover short distances, and even with that they needed mechanics to be with them at all times. It also didn't help that they were very expensive, leaving them only accessible to the rich and elite, and even many members of the so-called elite didn't fancy them because they were so loud and messy. With that being said, one thing was clear: Karl needed to convince the world that the automobile was here to stay. Music. One morning in the summer of 1888, Bertha Benz got up very early while Karl was still in bed and hopped into her husband's car to embark on one of the most important journeys in automobile history. She brought along her 2 sons and set out to visit her mother in Pforzheim, which was 66 miles away from Mannheim. Bertha didn't inform her husband nor the police about her plans, most likely because if they knew, they would let her go. At the time, no car or motorized carriage had ever previously attempted a journey that long, but she was determined to prove the importance of Benz's invention. However, her trip was no walk in the park. Bertha encountered many problems along the way, like crossing dusty and stony roads that were made for horses, having to stop by a pharmacy to get more gas, and even having to perform a few mechanical repairs. The 66-mile trip took Bertha and her 2 sons over 12 hours, but eventually they all made it safely to Pforzheim. More than anything, the trip achieved the goal Bertha had set out to achieve: to make people notice that the automobile was the next big thing. With this, the Benz motorwagen became the talk of the town and received great publicity for Karl's business. Soon enough, Benz and C began to expand quickly, so much so that by 1890 it had become the second largest engine manufacturer in Germany, though not by selling their cars but rather their stationary gasoline engines. But with the addition of 2 new business partners, Friedrich von Fischer Walter and Julius. Guns. They would soon help to turn this around as they took care of the business and marketing side of things. Benz could focus more on his engineering goals and was able to patent several new car innovations such as the planetary gear transmission, the double pivot steering, and the flat engine with a boxer configuration. He also designed and manufactured a new and improved automobile at the recommendation of his business partners, which hit the market in 1893. He called it the Benz Victoria. This was a more luxurious two-passenger vehicle.